In any public exchange between two figures with contrasting communication styles, the power of factual clarity often becomes the decisive element that shapes audience perception. When a seasoned speaker like Barack Obama responds to an argument that is broad, vague, or insufficiently supported, the impact is immediate and visible, not because of aggression or personal attack, but because articulation grounded in logic naturally exposes the fragility of an argument lacking depth. In situations like the one suggested, the moment Obama begins speaking, he typically employs a combination of calm tone, structured reasoning, and well-chosen examples that directly address the core of the issue. This method doesn't merely rebut an opposing view. It highlights the importance of preparation, evidence, and context. For someone like Ivanka Trump, whose public persona often leans on general optimism, branding language, and simplified perspectives on complex issues, a direct confrontation with a highly detailed, evidence-backed explanation can create a noticeable contrast in confidence levels. Obama's communication strategy usually begins with establishing a clear foundation, defining the problem, identifying the misconceptions or missing pieces in the opposing argument, and then layering factual points in a way that appears both accessible and authoritative. This approach is effective because it does not rely on emotional counterattacks or personal criticism. Instead, it draws attention to the substance, or lack thereof, behind the original statement. When someone hears a strong, concise, articulate breakdown of an issue, it naturally reshapes how they interpret the previous speaker's claims. The audience begins to see gaps that they might not have noticed earlier. This effect can be particularly strong on live television, where reactions, body language, and pacing cannot be edited or refined after the fact. For someone unprepared for such a direct and detailed response, the pressure becomes visible almost instantly. Viewers recognize hesitation, shifts in posture, or attempts to reformulate statements that originally sounded confident but now appear incomplete. In a scenario like this, Ivanka's argument may come across as weakened not because she lacks intelligence or sincerity, but because her communication style is typically more focused on broad themes such as empowerment, economic optimism, or entrepreneurial spirit. These topics are effective in controlled interviews or speeches, but when confronted with a deeply analytical, policy-based dismantling, the contrast becomes evident. Obama's style relies heavily on providing historical perspective, concrete statistics, and broader socio-political context, all of which can overshadow a simpler or more general claim. The moment of collapse, what the title refers to as her crumbling, doesn't necessarily mean a dramatic breakdown. More realistically, it represents the experience of being unable to respond with equal depth or precision. It can be seen in shorter answers, attempts to pivot to unrelated talking points, nervousness, or conceding points indirectly. Television magnifies such moments, making them appear more dramatic than they might feel in the room. But the real significance lies in what this dynamic teaches. When an argument lacks preparation, evidence, or clarity, it becomes extremely vulnerable in the presence of a well-constructed counterargument. Obama often emphasizes the need for understanding complexity rather than reducing policies or national challenges into simplified sound bites. His ability to communicate complex ideas in relatable terms gives him a strategic advantage in debates or interviews. In contrast, Ivanka's political involvement, while notable, has often been shaped by broad messaging frameworks rather than deep policy engagement. Therefore, when challenged with detailed socioeconomic reasoning, labor statistics, or historical policy outcomes, responding with the same level of sophistication can be difficult. This gap becomes even more pronounced when the exchange happens live, with no opportunity to revise statements or consult advisors. Another important factor is Obama's mastery of rhetorical timing. He often waits for the exact moment when the opposing argument reaches its most vulnerable point, usually when it becomes clear that the claim is too simplistic or unsupported, and then introduces a concise factual correction. This technique not only strengthens his credibility, but simultaneously places pressure on the other speaker to defend a position that now appears less stable. In such a situation, the opposing speaker may struggle to maintain composure, especially if their argument was crafted more for inspirational effect rather than factual strength. The dynamic illustrated by the title ultimately reflects the broader truth about public discourse. The stronger argument is not the one delivered with the most confidence, but the one supported by evidence, clear reasoning, and contextual understanding. When one participant excels in those areas and the other relies more on generalities, the outcome becomes predictable. The audience recognizes the shift immediately, making the exchange feel dramatic as the weaker argument begins to unravel under the weight of a stronger one. Obama's ability to remain calm, composed, and intellectually grounded in the middle of a tense exchange reveals a deeper truth about how effective communication works, especially on live television, where every reaction is magnified and every moment is scrutinized in real time. When responding to an argument he considers incomplete, misguided, or lacking context, he doesn't rush, raise his voice, or rely on dramatic expressions. Instead, he slows the tempo, chooses his words carefully, and speaks with a measured confidence that immediately signals to the audience that he is in full control of the discussion. This calmness itself becomes a form of strength, one that directly shapes how viewers interpret both his message and the contrasting message of the person he's responding to. When Ivanka Trump presents an argument that is more surface level or heavily reliant on broad optimism, Obama's steady clarity acts as a natural counterweight. His presence alone gently exposes any weaknesses in her statements without ever needing to directly declare them as such. Part of this comes from the depth of experience he carries into any political or policy-related conversation. Years of governing, debating, and navigating complex global issues have shaped a style of communication that is rooted in nuance. When he replies to an opposing argument, he does so from a place of accumulated knowledge, which makes his reasoning feel grounded and reassuring. This is particularly intimidating for someone whose arguments are more aspirational than analytical. Ivanka often speaks through the lens of branding, appealing to inspiration, positivity, and the emotional dimension of social issues. But when these kinds of responses are placed against a detailed, structured explanation from someone like Obama, the audience naturally gravitates toward the explanation that feels more tangible and complete. The contrast amplifies the perception of imbalance, even if both participants entered the conversation with the same amount of confidence. Another key factor is Obama's ability to subtly guide the emotional tone of a conversation. He doesn't rely on sarcasm, hostility, or dismissal. Instead, he uses empathy and relatability to soften the tension before inserting the more factual and challenging parts of his response. This approach disarms the opposing speaker because it prevents them from using defensiveness as a shield. When someone responds aggressively, it's easy to dismiss them emotionally, but when someone responds calmly and respectfully while still revealing the flaws in your argument, it becomes much harder to recover your footing. Obama excels at this particular balance, offering critique without sounding confrontational. That tone sets a high bar for the other speaker, who must then try to match not only the intellectual strength of his argument, but also the maturity of his delivery. Ivanka's communication style, often shaped by media appearances, brand promotion, and curated interviews, is not built for this kind of dynamic pressure. Her approach tends to rely on rehearsed lines or key phrases meant to sound polished and uplifting. But live exchanges with skilled debaters demand flexibility and improvisation, qualities that come naturally to Obama. He can pivot effortlessly when new information is introduced, expand his point without losing clarity, or shift the conversation into a broader context that further weakens the opposing argument. This kind of improvisational strength becomes especially visible when the other participant struggles to adapt. If Ivanka attempts to return to her original talking points after Obama has reframed the issue, she may appear repetitive or disconnected from the flow of the conversation. That dissonance, even if subtle, creates the impression that her argument is unraveling. Additionally, Obama's explanations typically include real-world examples, historical references, or data points that remind the audience of the complexity behind political and economic issues. This prevents the conversation from staying at the surface level. When Ivanka offers a hopeful statement about business, economics, or social opportunity, Obama can respond by pointing to specific cases or past outcomes that challenge the simplistic framing of her claim. This does not just counter her point, it expands the conversation into a space where her argument lacks the weight to stand on its own. Once the discussion shifts into policy depth or historical understanding, viewers instinctively lean toward the speaker who seems more knowledgeable and more prepared. Live television magnifies the emotional stakes of such exchanges. A slight pause, a moment of uncertainty, or a forced smile can communicate vulnerability. If Ivanka appears hesitant after Obama delivers a clear and comprehensive rebuttal, the audience interprets this as her argument being weakened or crumbling, even without any verbal concession. The psychological pressure of being outmatched intellectually can lead to shorter responses, defensive phrasing, or attempts to redirect the topic, all of which signal difficulty in maintaining her original stance. Ultimately, the core of this dynamic lies in the difference between aspirational communication and analytical communication. Aspirational messages focus on hope, vision, and broad ideas. Analytical messages focus on facts, evidence, and logical structure. Both can be powerful, but when placed head-to-head in a real-time exchange, the argument with more depth, detail, and grounding tends to dominate. Obama's strength lies in weaving emotional intelligence with logical clarity. Ivanka's challenge is that her style, while appealing in other contexts, loses momentum when pressed for specifics. The moment this contrast becomes visible, the perceived imbalance of the exchange becomes inevitable. In many high-profile discussions, especially those that involve contrasting political perspectives, one of the most defining elements is the ability to frame an issue in a way that resonates both logically and emotionally with the audience. Barack Obama has mastered this form of narrative framing. Rather than simply responding to an argument on a surface level, he restructures the entire conversation by placing the issue within a broader social, economic, or historical context. This shift in perspective often exposes the oversimplification or incompleteness of the opposing argument. When Ivanka Trump presents a point that leans heavily on optimism, personal experience, or a narrow lens, Obama broadens the landscape, showing viewers that the topic is more complex and multifaceted than her explanation suggests. This reframing does not just counter her point, it diminishes its relevance by revealing how much of the larger picture it overlooks. One of the strategies Obama uses in these exchanges is to highlight the interconnected nature of problems. For instance, if someone argues that improving economic opportunity is solely about entrepreneurship or personal motivation, he will expand the conversation to include systemic factors such as education access, wage inequality, healthcare, and policy decisions that disproportionately affect different demographics. This expansion creates a more realistic and layered understanding of the issue. In doing so, Obama underscores that meaningful solutions require comprehensive thinking, not isolated claims. Ivanka's arguments often emphasize empowerment through individual effort or business creativity, but when faced with Obama's contextual framing, they can appear incomplete or detached from the deeper structural realities. Another strength Obama brings to these discussions is his ability to use relatable stories to support his broader points. He does not rely solely on statistics or general statements. He often incorporates real experiences of ordinary people, drawing from years of interacting with diverse communities. These stories help the audience connect emotionally with his reasoning, making it harder for a simplified argument to resonate at the same level. Personal anecdotes bridge the gap between abstract policy and lived experience. They give weight to the idea that challenges are not theoretical. They impact real human beings whose situations cannot always be explained by general statements of optimism. When Ivanka presents an argument focused on generalized benefit or potential, Obama's grounding of the issue in real life reveals the gaps between ideals and reality. Another way Obama reframes the conversation is by emphasizing long-term consequences. Instead of arguing about what seems correct in the present moment, he pushes the audience to consider what the argument means for the future. He might ask what the long-term outcome will be if a certain policy is ignored, or what generational impact a flawed assumption could create. This future-oriented framing makes an argument focused only on short-term positivity seem insufficient. Ivanka's public messaging often centers on immediate encouragement and broad motivational ideas. While appealing, this approach can falter when matched against a detailed projection of future risks, responsibilities, or potential unintended consequences. Once the conversation shifts toward long-term implications, the audience naturally gravitates toward the argument that acknowledges nuance and complexity. Additionally, Obama frequently reframes criticism by transforming it into a lesson about civic responsibility or collective effort. Instead of focusing on who is right or wrong in a narrow sense, he expands the argument to highlight what society should be striving for. This transcends partisan or individual differences, making any defensive or limited argument seem petty by comparison. If Ivanka's position is framed around defending an administration or promoting a particular initiative without acknowledging limitations, Obama's broader, more inclusive framing makes her point appear more narrow and self-contained. This shift in tone sets a moral and intellectual standard that is difficult for a less comprehensive argument to match. Another aspect of Obama's reframing strategy lies in redefining the underlying assumptions of the opposing argument. If someone presents a point based on the assumption that opportunity is equal for everyone, he challenges that assumption directly, showing how access varies based on race, class, geography, and education. By doing this, he forces the argument into a more honest and realistic space. Ivanka's messaging often assumes or implies a level playing field, focusing on personal ambition and entrepreneurship. Obama's reframing highlights the structural disparities that complicate that narrative, making the original argument appear overly idealistic. This does not just weaken the opposing point, it demonstrates that it rests on an unrealistic foundation. Furthermore, Obama's gentle but firm reframing puts psychological pressure on his discussion partner. When the conversation shifts into deeper territory, historical context, data-backed reasoning, embedded social issues, the other speaker must follow him into that depth or risk appearing uninformed or unprepared. This creates a dynamic where Ivanka must suddenly defend or expand upon a point that was not designed for such scrutiny. As the pressure increases, even small hesitations or minor inconsistencies become noticeable. The audience reads these moments as signs that the argument is losing strength. What began as a confident statement begins to unravel because the framework supporting it has been replaced by a more comprehensive and demanding one. Ultimately, Obama's reframing skill reveals a fundamental truth about effective discourse. The person who defines the scope of the argument usually controls its outcome. By broadening the context, deepening the analysis, and grounding the conversation in realism and long-term thinking, he reshapes the narrative into something far more complex than the original statement. When the opposing argument relies on simplicity, positivity, or limited perspective, it struggles to survive in this expanded space. The shift in framing does not need aggression or confrontation. It simply reveals that the original argument is insufficient for the deeper conversation Obama insists on having. Another significant element in exchanges like the one suggested is Obama's exceptional ability to transform disagreement into a lesson about leadership, responsibility, and intellectual honesty. Rather than viewing a contrasting viewpoint as an attack or an obstacle, he uses it as a springboard to illuminate the principles he believes should guide public dialogue. This elevates the conversation, often leaving the other speaker struggling to maintain their original position because the discussion has shifted to a higher standard, one focused on depth, complexity, and accountability. Ivanka Trump, whose arguments are often shaped around polished messaging and inspirational tones, can find herself in a difficult position when Obama redefines the conversation around rigorous truth rather than appealing presentation. This shift forces a kind of confrontation with substance that aspirational rhetoric alone cannot sustain. Her argument may begin confidently, but once Obama introduces themes such as civic duty, historical patterns, or empirical evidence, the conversation takes on a level of seriousness that demands a different kind of preparation. One of the key ways Obama accomplishes this is by insisting on clarity of intention. He carefully identifies not only what he disagrees with, but why the argument misses the deeper issues at play. This method redirects the focus from personalities to principles. It is not about proving someone wrong in a superficial sense. It is about questioning the motivations, assumptions, and values underlying a position. For Ivanka, whose media presence often relies on staying positive, avoiding controversy, and framing everything in constructive terms, such principled scrutiny can be difficult to respond to. When Obama turns the conversation toward deeper questions, what are we truly trying to solve? Who benefits, who is left out? It becomes challenging to maintain an argument that was not anchored in a full spectrum understanding of the issue. The audience sees this immediately, recognizing the weight of Obama's reasoning and the comparative lightness of the opposing argument. Obama's skill in dismantling weak points also comes from his ability to articulate contradictions without sounding confrontational. He has a subtle way of repeating the opposing speaker's argument back to them in clearer terms, then gently pointing out the inconsistencies. This reflective method exposes gaps in logic that the original speaker may not even have realized were present. When Ivanka's argument is reframed in this way, it can suddenly sound less convincing than when she first delivered it. Obama's calm delivery and respectful tone make the critique hit harder because it feels undeniably logical. The audience can sense the imbalance. One person operates with full awareness of nuance and context, while the other leans on generalities that crumble when mirrored back analytically. Another critical aspect of Obama's method is that he often refuses to let the conversation remain at the level of branding or personal narrative. Ivanka frequently speaks from the perspective of individual success, entrepreneurial spirit, or the idea that personal drive can overcome any obstacle. Obama challenges this by grounding the conversation in the lived experiences of millions, whose circumstances cannot be shaped solely by motivation. He redirects the discussion towards structural factors, economic systems, educational disparities, racial inequities, and governmental responsibilities. This not only exposes the limitations of Ivanka's claim, but makes it clear that focusing exclusively on personal empowerment ignores broader realities. It becomes difficult for her to continue promoting a narrative of individual triumph when Obama has already shown that such messaging fails to address the challenges faced by average citizens. By shifting the focus, he pulls the audience into a larger truth that seems undeniable once spoken. Obama's approach also emphasizes humility, a quality that strengthens his credibility and makes his arguments more relatable. He openly acknowledges the complexity of issues, the mistakes of past leaders, and the ongoing challenges that defy easy solutions. This humility contrasts sharply with arguments based on certainty without depth. Ivanka often speaks with confident, polished optimism, but optimism without acknowledgement of complexity can appear naive when placed next to a thoughtful, balanced perspective. Obama's humility makes Ivanka's confidence appear oversimplified by comparison. The more earnest and realistic he sounds, the more her argument struggles to maintain its original force. Another factor that plays into this dynamic is Obama's understanding of audience psychology. He knows that people respond not just to facts, but to fairness, sincerity, and emotional balance. Every time he addresses a flawed argument calmly and respectfully, he gains more trust from viewers. That trust becomes a powerful tool. Once the audience trusts him, they become less receptive to opposing points that seem shallow or incomplete. Ivanka may continue to push her talking points, but if the audience has already aligned emotionally with Obama's honesty and clarity, her message loses traction. This psychological tilt becomes visible as the conversation unfolds. Even if she attempts to recover or reiterate her original point, the momentum is no longer on her side. Finally, Obama's ability to set a moral tone adds another layer of pressure. When he frames an issue as a matter of fairness, justice, or the collective good, he forces the opposing argument into a moral comparison. Ivanka's argument, often rooted in promoting opportunities, positivity, or economic growth, may not explicitly address ethical considerations. Once Obama brings morality into the conversation, her position must answer to that higher standard, and if it cannot, it loses power. He does this without directly attacking her integrity. Instead, he elevates the discussion in a way that highlights the incomplete moral grounding of her argument. As the conversation shifts toward values and responsibilities, the weaker argument struggles to stay relevant. In these ways, Obama's style doesn't merely refute, it elevates, reframes, and exposes. His emphasis on clarity, humility, fairness, and depth sets a benchmark that aspirational but shallow arguments cannot reach. When that contrast becomes clear, the opposing viewpoint falters under the weight of his moral and intellectual presence. A final factor that shapes moments like these is Obama's ability to turn a simple exchange into a demonstration of how credibility is built, not through image, confidence, or polished sound bites, but through consistency, depth, and an evident command of the subject. Credibility in public discourse is not something that can be manufactured instantly. It emerges through a long-term pattern of informed decision, making, reflective thinking, and honest acknowledgement of challenges. When Obama speaks, he carries with him years of political experience, intellectual rigor, and public trust built through countless speeches, debates, and leadership decisions. This background becomes an invisible force in the conversation. The audience instinctively senses that he has the weight of lived experience behind every point he makes. In contrast, Ivanka Trump, while articulate and media-trained, often relies more on the authority derived from her position within a well-known family rather than from extensive policy leadership. When these two forms of credibility are placed next to each other, the difference becomes unmistakable. Obama's credibility feels earned, while hers feels inherited, and this contrast shapes how the audience interprets their arguments. Another element strengthening Obama's presence in such moments is the authenticity that comes from speaking plainly about difficult truths. He does not shy away from complexity or uncomfortable realities. Instead, he anchors his arguments in facts, acknowledges nuance, and presents the issue in its full seriousness. This approach resonates because it respects the intelligence of the audience. People can sense when a speaker is simplifying an issue too much, and they appreciate the honesty of someone who avoids that temptation. Ivanka's messaging, often polished and upbeat, can sometimes come across as an attempt to maintain a certain image rather than address the deeper realities of the topic. When faced with Obama's willingness to confront hard truths directly, her positivity can feel mismatched with the seriousness of the conversation. The audience interprets Obama's approach as more grounded and sincere, strengthening his credibility even further. Obama also excels at anticipating counterarguments before they arise. He addresses the flaws in an opposing viewpoint, not only by explaining why it is insufficient, but by outlining how a more complete understanding should look. This strategy effectively leaves less room for the opposing speaker to maneuver. If Ivanka attempts to clarify or defend her point after Obama has already covered the weaknesses and potential rebuttals, she risks sounding repetitive or uninformed. Obama's anticipatory reasoning demonstrates a high level of intellectual preparedness, something difficult to match in a spontaneous exchange. It reveals that he has not only processed the opposing argument, but has already moved several steps beyond it, showing the audience that he is thinking on a deeper level. This leaves the other speakers struggling to find new ground to stand on, often prompting them to retreat into safer, more generic statements. Furthermore, Obama's use of logical progression gives his arguments a sense of inevitability. He structures his replies in a clear sequence, starting with a premise, building through evidence, and concluding with a powerful insight. This logical flow makes his points feel internally complete, leaving no loose ends for the opposing speaker to exploit. In contrast, Ivanka's arguments often rely on a central idea or message of hope, without the same layered structure. When the conversation shifts into a more logical or analytical direction, her points may appear less robust because they are not built on the same step-by-step reasoning. The audience naturally gravitates toward the argument that feels more complete and logically sound. Another aspect that amplifies Obama's credibility is his consistency. Whether discussing economic policy, social issues, or political responsibility, he maintains the same tone of seriousness and grounding. This consistency gives the impression of integrity. He does not adjust his message simply to win a moment or appeal superficially to viewers. Ivanka, however, often adapts her tone and content depending on the interviewer, the platform, or the audience. This adaptability can be useful in controlled environments, but in a direct exchange with someone who is unwavering in conviction, it risks appearing less authentic. When Obama maintains a consistent framework of reasoning, the contrast can make Ivanka's adjustments appear strategic rather than sincere. Credibility is deeply tied to perceived authenticity, and Obama often appears more firmly rooted in his principles during such exchanges. The visual aspect of credibility also comes into play. Obama's demeanor, steady eye contact, relaxed body language, and thoughtful pauses signals confidence without arrogance. These physical cues reinforce the impression that he is speaking from a place of knowledge rather than defensiveness. Ivanka's body language, when confronted with detailed or unexpected rebuttals, may shift subtly, hesitation in her voice, a quick glance downward, or an attempt to recalibrate her expression. Viewers pick up on these small signals, often without realizing it, and interpret them as indicators of who is more secure in their position. Even if Ivanka continues to speak smoothly, the momentary lapses in composure can suggest that her argument is under strain. Finally, Ubama's credibility is strengthened by his ability to connect personal responsibility to national responsibility. He often frames issues in terms of what leaders owe the public, what citizens owe each other, and what values should underpin decision-making. This moral dimension elevates his argument beyond technical correctness and into the realm of ethical authority. Ivanka's points, which tend to emphasize empowerment and opportunity, may not address this deeper moral dimension. When Ubama places the discussion in a framework of justice, fairness, and shared responsibility, the opposing argument appears narrower and less complete. The audience feels the weight of his message because it appeals not only to the intellect, but also to the conscience. In the end, credibility becomes the silent force that shapes the outcome of exchanges like these. Ubama's credibility, earned through experience, clarity, humility, and moral grounding, stands in stark contrast to the more curated and surface-level credibility that Ivanka projects. When the two forms collide in a high-pressure, real-time conversation, the difference becomes visible in seconds, and the argument supported by deeper credibility inevitably prevails.